Okay, so it is noon, and I want to welcome everyone to our Kelsey Museum January Flash Talk. Today, joining me as our presenter is Mike Sampson of the University of Manitoba. Um, we're so excited that he is with us today. And his presentation, The Books of Karanis, will be the focus of this talk. And he's been doing this research affiliated with the Kelsey for a couple years now. So I want to welcome Mike Sampson. Thank you so much. And I will mute myself, and I encourage everyone to stay muted until the end when we will open it up for questions. Okay,
Thank you
thank you
so
so
much,
much.
Stephanie. It's wonderful to be here. When the invitation arrived, I smiled and I was very happy because, of course, none of the work that I'm doing would be possible without the Kelsey. And so to be invited to come and speak with you here at the Kelsey, well, virtually at the Kelsey, it was a great thrill for me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project I've been conducting for the last 4 or 5 years. With the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It's called The Books of Karanis, and to give you a brief overview of the remarks that I'm going to present today, I want to talk quickly about sort of the project goals and the difference between what I set out to do and what I ended up doing. Then I'll peel back the curtain a little bit on some of the legacy data that I've been relying on in thinking about papyri and the archaeological record. And this is really where the Kelsey's support has been invaluable because there's so much evidence, so much documentation from the decade of excavations at Karanis that working with them has been a great challenge, but also a great thrill. And lastly, in the final part of the presentation, I'll show you a few things that we've discovered, some of the directions that we're going, and hopefully some of the insights that we can disseminate. So going back to the project goals, we have all seen Karanis, I hope. If you haven't, here's a picture, excavations underway. These are work scenes on a hill. This is a negative that is in the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. The university, as you know, excavated there between 1924 and 1935. And when I set out to design the books of Karanis, I thought that I was going to be studying Greek literary culture by looking at the papyri and the literary papyri in particular and contextualizing them in the archaeological record. That was my goal. That was what I set out to do. And along the way, what I realized I was doing was that I was actually doing the archaeology of Karanis more broadly. Via the papyri and via the work of contextualizing literary papyri in the archaeological record, it turns out that I've been working on the chronology of Karanis and understanding in particular the formation processes that have led to its archaeological record in the form that it was excavated. And so it's kind of the archaeology of an archaeological expedition is what's been going on. And so I'll insert my friend Drake here to indicate how things have changed and the happy direction that I've now been going in. One of the things that is has been a consequence of this sort of shift in goals is that in looking at certain conclusions that have been drawn in the past by papyrologists and sometimes by archaeologists, I've had to rethink things and have come to a different understanding. And so I'm presenting you here a slide of one of the neighborhoods in Karanis. This is so-called Area G. And I've simply mapped onto the picture here for your benefit the fine spots of the various Homer papyri from Area G. Some of you may be familiar with the Archive of Socrates, the Tax Collector, which is the subject of a very famous article by a preeminent papyrologist, Peter van Minnen, in Cincinnati. And he has sort of identified Socrates and Socrates' house. And we talk about sort of the library of texts that Socrates worked on. And in many cases, sort of as I looked and poked and prodded a little more closely, some of the arguments were difficult to reconcile with the archaeological record. And what I want to show you here, just simply by indicating the various copies of the Iliad that were found in Socrates' neighborhood, is that there's more material here than reasonably could have belonged to a single man or a single library. We've got several copies of Book One that are in evidence, and they're all from different book rolls, different copies of Book Two as well. There's more than one source for these papyri, which have become dispersed in the archaeological record. And I have publications about this neighborhood that I'm happy to provide the citations for. What are we dealing with when we deal with the Kelsey's legacy data? A century old now. In some cases, it's really quite remarkable that we have all of this stuff, that it's so old and that it has still been not completely synthesized and published. Well, I've been able to go back and with the support of collections managers and curators in the museum to assemble and bring together and to sort of pore over different aspects. My particular focus is, of course, the literary papyri, and so I'm looking at contexts where literary papyri were found. But in order to understand those contexts, I've had to recourse to the Kelsey's record of objects from the excavations. There's numerous maps and plans, some of them quite wonderful and rich. There's archival photography. Thousands of photographs were taken in the field, documenting visually what was taking place. And what I have discovered is that almost as important as the photographs themselves are the captions that were recorded. To give you examples of all of these things, here's a picture of the record of objects in its current Excel form, so digitized and collated here into a spreadsheet, makes things easy to search, makes things easy to organize. But of course, in the bowels of the Kelsey, there are hard copy records. And one of the fun trips I had a few years ago was with Michelle's assistants in the archives, pouring through the handwritten record of objects, the originals that have been subsequently digitized. And they're really illuminating in a number of ways because you don't realize it, but in this case, from the first season in particular, the Egyptian workman, the laborer who was excavating a particular context, gets recorded in the handwritten record of objects. This is Ahmed Osman. We know him from other sources and from other excavations, and he was assigned to excavate House 5006, Chamber E2, which is a vaulted storage chamber. And there he found 165 papyri in the lower half of the filling of the chamber, mixed with sand and broken mud bricks. So the record of objects has been digitized, but there are still some treasures in the old analog version. In terms of maps and plans, we can go all the way back to the first season. Here are some of the maps, or one of the maps that was drawn by Sammy Ivan, who was the surveyor in those early campaigns. In the third season, we find this crudely drawn, handwritten map of Area G, which I've already used in this presentation. But from the fourth season on, Terentieff was responsible for the mapping and planning of the site, and we get very, very precise and well-drawn plans. These are the ones that most people think of when they are publishing and discussing the archaeology and the plans from Karanis, the Terentieff plans. Photographs are important too, as I say. My favorite one is this one from Area G, where the Sebakine were accumulating huge amounts of sebak to be carted away by the Daira Agnelli estate. This was part of the interesting agreement that the excavation had made with the local industry that was extracting fertilizer from the ancient ruins. And there was a symbiotic relationship between the two that did occasionally break down. And as I say, the captions to these photographs are important. So I've provided this one here in full, dump heaps. It tells us what season, it tells us what direction we are looking at. It even gives us a date, and we have a photo credit. Anthony Chubb took this picture. And of course, the Kelsey Museum negative number is provided. But just like the record of objects, the photographs that are in the Kelsey archives have been digitized and assembled into a spreadsheet. And so here's an extract from that outlook. And I've found a great deal of important information in the captions in particular, which have helped me understand better what it is I'm looking at or what it is I'm studying. I know this is a flash talk, so I'm trying to be brief, but I do want to give you a bit of a glimpse into some of the work that we've been doing and some of the insights and conclusions that we have arrived at. And the big one, which will probably come as no surprise to any of you, is that interdisciplinarity is a good thing, and breaking down the silos that sometimes exist between researchers who are working on related material in different ways or from different disciplinary perspectives. If we can get past those silos, we can often have very, very fruitful conversations. I am first and foremost a papyrologist, which is to say I'm interested primarily, or I was interested primarily in the texts. But for those of you who don't work with papyri, you should know that the way that papyrologists typically proceed is by making connections and by linking things together and sort of making a network of connections that fleshes out a richer picture. X is like Y. This text is like that text. This person is the same person we find in this other document. This date, this place. The connections between different nodes in a network is really at the core of what papyrologists are doing. And if you want to sort of visualize this methodology, I would call it a kind of top-down, where we take the text itself and then we begin to spread the tentacles and extend them into as many other parallels as we can. Archaeologists, of course, proceed differently. They excavate, they uncover things, and they accumulate huge amounts of data on the ground from the material culture of a site. And in bringing it together and accumulating it, their analysis works essentially from the ground up. And so the two approaches are often going in different directions. And sometimes the two are, my slide is incorrect here. Sometimes the two can reinforce one another and come to similar conclusions, but sometimes the inferences that papyrology would draw are difficult to reconcile with the evidence. So there are both good things and bad things in this interdisciplinary approach, where the papyrologist and the archaeologist can agree on something, and in some cases, they're going to disagree. Some of the work that I've been doing with my team involves taking different objects in the collections database and trying to collate them and bring them together. And so, for example, I'm looking at literary papyri. I'm looking to see whether there are other datable things in the papyrological context that we find them. Are there numismatics? Are there ceramics? And in many cases, thanks to the rich data, the answer is yes. One of the things that my team has discovered is that in most cases, the dates assigned to a piece of pottery, if the date can be assigned, is a couple of centuries later than the date assigned to the papyrus that it was found near. And that is a methodological problem that my archaeologist collaborators are still grappling with. So a famous example of this is, of course, the African red slit pottery, some examples of which in the Kelsey are here shown. But we find them in, for example, House 5017 or 5016. And the dates that have traditionally been assigned to these pots are sort of late 3rd, 4th, even into the 5th century. And what I found really, really interesting is, well, okay, House 5017, 5016 happens to be just across the street from another famous context where those 165 papyri in House 5006, I showed you the snapshot from the Record of Objects a few minutes ago. Well, those 165 papyri that were found right next to this 4th century pottery, they typically are dated to the 1st or 2nd, sometimes the 3rd century of the Common Era. So there's a real discrepancy there. And that is one of the things that we have been grappling with and trying to understand as we think about papyri and how they get into the archaeological record. It's been about 15 minutes, so I will curtail my remarks here, but I do want to thank, as I did at the beginning, the Kelsey Museum for supporting the work of the Books of Karanis project. And this goes from the curators through the collections managers, and also my very, very gifted collaborators who have roots in the Kelsey themselves have been of invaluable assistance. So I'll end it here, and I'm happy to field all sorts of questions.
Thank you so much. Um, so, as Mike said, let's open it up to questions. So feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself at this point and ask questions. Um, I guess just to kick us off, are there any next steps with this project or additional research that you're interested in?
Yes, is the short answer. The current work that I'm doing involves studying the so-called archives that have been uncovered at Karanis, so sort of assemblages of materials that papyrologists have a habit of labeling as archives, but which in many cases the label archive is perhaps not justified by what the archaeological evidence would suggest. And many archives are, in fact, assemblages that papyrologists have themselves constructed, not on the basis of the archaeological record, but on the basis of the connections. And so, one of the things I would like to do is to sort of expand the papyrological understanding of what an archive is to sort of allow for gradations of archivality, where some things that are found in closed contexts that are clearly all pertaining to the same person from the same date, yes, we can label these as archives in fairly high confidence. But there are other assemblages where perhaps not all of those boxes are ticked in the same way, and so we have to allow that they appear to resemble an archive, but we don't know if they were deliberately curated and deposited in antiquity by the archives keeper, for example. So that's one direction where I'm currently spending not enough of my time.
Thank you. So we have a few questions coming in. So I'll read out the first one from Kristen. Regarding the dating of the pottery sherds and papyri, what method or methods have been used?
Yeah, this is the realm of my collaborator, Nick Hudson, who works at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. And he has extracted from the record of objects a complete list of all of the ceramic vessels. And by cross-referencing those vessels with the pottery key, which helps identify the forms and the shapes, as well as the line drawings that were taken of the pots that were being found, he has been able to identify with a high degree of confidence the various African red slip forms. And those forms have been studied a little bit. So Hayes, for example, came to the Kelsey back when he was working on late Roman pottery, and he studied the material that was there. But so many more never came back to Ann Arbor, but are recorded in the record of objects that now it turns out, thanks to Nick's work, we've been able to identify like 600 examples of African red slip in the record of objects. And so as I say, he's been able to make those identifications on the basis of line drawings and the descriptions, the typology that was used in recording them in the record of objects.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Linda. You showed a map of locations where the Iliad papyri were located. Have you also noticed other literary papyri?
Yes, so there's approximately 80 or so literary fragments from the site of Karanis. That number sort of is a bit flexible depending on how literary you consider a certain thing to be. Of course, Homer is the most popular of authors who's presented both in Karanis but really across Greco-Roman Egypt. We also have examples of Demosthenes and Menander in particular have come from Karanis. And there are others. Hesiod has appeared as well in small numbers and little bits of lyric poetry as well. But by far the most prominent are Homer, which makes him the easiest one to discuss in a presentation like this.
Interesting. Wow. Any additional questions?
I have one. I'll ask. Can you hear me? Yes?
Oh, yeah. Go
Okay,
ahead,
perfect.
Laurel.
I was just wondering about this dating discrepancy. Do we know that these structures you mentioned, 5006 and then the 1617, were they occupied, do we think at the same time, or is that a possible explanation for some of this dating discrepancies?
So what my current hypothesis is that the lifespan of this neighborhood was significantly broader than the rather primitive stratigraphy that the excavators were using and applying to the site allowed for. And so if we are finding in the vaulted chamber 5006 E2 examples of papyri that span the first, second, third, and even a few examples of fourth century papyri there, and if we're finding in the structure next door examples of fourth and even fifth century African red slip pottery, what that suggests to me, the non-archaeologist I'll add, is that this neighborhood was being inhabited or frequented at least from at least the second century through the fourth or fifth century. And that makes the stratigraphy of the neighborhood really, really, really much more complicated than the excavators could ever have understood. And unfortunately, one of the difficulties in working with the century-old legacy data is that from the excavator's point of view, those hundreds of years have been compressed into, in many cases, one, two, or three different strata that are sort of quite closely compacted. Whereas now we can appreciate, I think, the longevity of the neighborhood and by extension of Karanis more broadly.
Thank you.
Great. So we have another question in the chat that I'll read out from Dave. Are the few Christian texts found separate or generally intermingled with other literary texts?
That's a really good question. And the scholar who's worked most closely with the Christian papyri from Karanis is Greg Schwendner, another Michigan product and papyrologist. My recollection, I'm now trying to visualize the map in my head. My recollection is that the Christian papyri, like the literary papyri more generally, are scattered across the site and tend to pop up not in clusters, but individually. In many ways, the map of Homer that I showed you is not entirely representative because it does appear that you get sort of big chunks of Homer all from one neighborhood. But in reality, the papyri from the site are sort of scattered in different neighborhoods quite broadly. And I do not recall that the Christian ones are clustered in any way, either with other Christian ones or with other literary papyri.
Thank you. Let's see. Do we have additional questions? Oh, let's see here. We have a question that just popped up from Grace. Um, have you found that some of the literary papyri are more reliable for dating compared to others? If so, what are they? And is there a pattern to it? Example, most helpful papyri are books from the Iliad or from Demotis, etc.
So the dating of literary papyri is one of those great vexed questions in the field, because unlike documents, which often have a date recording when they were written down, literary papyri do not. And so papyrologists are forced to evaluate literary papyri and to assign dates to them based on their handwriting, that is to say, on their paleography. And unfortunately, the paleographical dating of literary papyri is more of an art than an exact science. And so it will occasionally happen where you could get three different papyrologists in the room and show them the same scrap, and they would assign three different dates to it. And that means that there's a certain amount of wiggle room, and we have to allow for a certain amount of debate. The literary papyri from Karanis and the Homer ones in particular that I'm thinking of are in some cases, not many, are in some cases quite informal, and that makes them even harder to pin down. But yeah, there's a fair bit of wiggle room. In general, I would say that the literary papyri tend to fall into the range of the second or third century CE. But I do know that one of the Iliad fragments that I was showing on the map does come from a later codex of the fourth or fifth centuries. And some of the other literary papyri also are going to be assigned later dates, but not too late. The irony with Karanis is that for the most part, the papyri don't shed light on anything beyond sort of the late fourth, fifth century. So we don't have a ton of super late material.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think we have time for 1 to 2 more questions. Well, if we don't have any additional questions, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mike Sampson for being with us today. This was a wonderful flash talk. Thank you so much. Um, if you do have additional questions, feel free to, you can email me, kelseyed at umich.edu, and I will forward these questions on. Um, Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your research.
You're very welcome. Thanks, everyone.